Gamergate 2.
Gamergate 2.
Gamergate 2.
Gamergate 2.
Gamergate 2.
Is already failing, and it's your fault, largely for the exact same reasons the original movement crumbled. But before we get into that, let's establish what Gamergate 2 even is. Back in 2023, I covered the consulting firm Sweet Baby Inc., with the notion of documenting why many Western games tend to feel narratively and aesthetically homogenized in recent years, whether they take place in a world akin to our own, one of fantasy, or anywhere in between. I didn't posit this was the sole reason, but presented it to be a factor, as the same people who were making games like Goodbye Volcano High were also taking part in the narrative writing and consulting of big budget titles like God of War Ragnarok, Marvel's Spider-Man 2, Alan Wake 2, Suicide Squad, and Gotham Knights, which is just a few of the titles they contributed to, as their list of clients is quite expansive, where if you were to look at their specific roles throughout these games, you'll be greeted with endless variations of story consulting with a focus on representation, sensitivity reading, and other similar sounding titles that ultimately imply they are heavily working with the developers to guide every story into a certain direction. Now, in the year or so following the release of this coverage, others also sought to document Sweet Baby's involvement in the industry, as well as identical companies. The increased awareness eventually leading to the true start of Gamergate 2 on February 29th, 2024. On this date, Chris Kindred, narrative designer at Sweet Baby, would launch his own harassment campaign at the Steam group Sweet Baby Inc. Detected, a curator page noting what video games the company worked on, simply using Sweet Baby's own website and other official credits. Chris in response would call for a complete shutdown of the group, its creator, and anybody associated. Unfortunately for him, they inevitably kicked up such a storm in their attempts to silence the group that mass media attention would be brought to Sweet Baby Inc. To exemplify the scope of that, at the time of their complaints, the group had around 3,000 members, but by the end of the month it was 300,000, and currently still growing. Whereas with the coverage continuing to escalate, the Gamergate 2 moniker would be adopted from both sides of the argument, and with that title, returned all the same malignant issues that ended up derailing the original Gamergate into becoming ineffective and irrelevant, instead of maintaining momentum in bringing awareness to the slimy business practices of games journalists and the ideological rot infestation in the games industry. The numerous grifters who attached themselves to the movement instead cared more about protecting their brand image. Discourse moved away from talking about legitimate issues and their causes to responding to whatever claim the media leveraged against Gamergate participants that week. "We're not sexist, we actually love diversity, you're the real racist," became the calling cards of every YouTuber who weighed in on the topic after just a few months. And the same thing is starting to occur again. This can already be found in the Steam group this all started from. You'll find post after post from the average users up to moderators actively defending the goals of Sweet Baby, simply stating that the actual problem is the company's approach. Any discussion of said company's politics is met with banning or punishment, trying to downplay the very existence of such a thing. All this is seemingly at the behest of trying to prove they're not the claimed bigots sites like Kotaku paint them as. And honestly, it feels like the entire group itself has been turned into the owner's own personal grab at eFame, as it's far more focused on shilling streams of games from companies deep into the very thing this group is supposed to be criticizing, more so than addressing larger problems in the industry. So I guess history's repeating in more ways than one. The content creator side doesn't fare any better. For example, YouTubers like The Act Man, who had previously defended censorship and mocked those concerned about such issues in the past, has begun switching it up since the gamers are getting some headway in the discussion. But this is just how these people operate. No matter the topic, you can see these influencer types constantly switching sides for whatever is the more supported group at the time, or if there's profit to be made. Just look at the paid review The Act Man did for Payday 3, which mysteriously had the title change once the game was released to the public. Zero consistency all around. Thus, these types will abandon these opinions all the same when enough articles call the movement bigoted, no different than Gamergate 1 figures like Chris Raygun before them. Conversely, you do have creators who are more genuine with their views, but fall into similar trappings due to ignorance or willful ignorance, such as Eric July, falsely attributing DEI's lack of hold on the Japanese markets, when some of the biggest gaming companies in the world, such as Capcom, Sony, Sega, Square Enix, and even the very company that owns Pokemon, not just its international branch, have departments dedicated to it. But perhaps worst of all is a common talking point among creators, displayed most aptly to us in a tweet by the almighty Lolly. Quote, Gamergate didn't kick off through politics. It was Zoe Quinn having sex with journalists for positive coverage for her game. Gamergate 2 didn't kick off with politics. It was Sweet Baby gunning for a Brazilian guy just for pointing out they exist. They made it about politics to obfuscate. This displays a few things. Most notable in statements like these, without fail, is the idea that these issues aren't political. Even going back to Gamergate Classic, the movement was in fact started by someone receiving biased coverage for sexual favors, bringing a spotlight to the questionable ethics of gaming journalists. But surely, for such a statement to exist at the scale it did, this wasn't the only unethical coverage that took place in the industry. So the question becomes, what were the other concerns?
Everything is sexist, everything is racist, everything is homophobic, and you have to point it all out.
Oof. Been a while since I heard that one. But that really summarizes it well, doesn't it? The problems people had with the games journalist industry was the ideology pushing. Demonizing games and their creators as sexist, bigoted, racist, as well as many other terms if it didn't fall in line with their left-wing political views, and generally pushing for a certain narrative in the industry by only propping up what falls within these politics, instead of honest coverage. Admitting this doesn't mean you wouldn't have an issue if the politics were reversed, but to claim no political basis is you obfuscating the problem. Even the main figurehead who brought such attention to the original Gamergate was Mr. Medicare, a man who's on the complete opposite side of the political spectrum, with his career being garnered over mocking SJWs and his original Quinspiracy series. The movement has a political basis any way you look at it. But ignoring the constant revisionism at play of the past, let's focus on the present for a moment, by looking at how the company that this all started from presents themselves on their website. Quote, Our mission is to tell better, more empathetic stories while diversifying and enriching the video game industry. Purposeful changes they believe to be done for the betterment of the industry are most observable in games they worked on that are sequels to past releases, such as the previously mentioned Alan Wake 2, Spider-Man 2, God of War 2, and technically even Suicide Squad, resulting in race swaps ranging from needing to manifest a second Deadshot than the one established in the prior Arkham games, characters in Norse mythology, or most telling is how Alan Wake's Saga Anderson was originally white before Sweet Baby's involvement. Then there's the downplaying of titular characters for more diverse new leads, a reworking of female characters' roles and physical appearance in the story, as well as the removal of any aspect deemed problematic. All things they seem to want to directly flaunt at the audience, just so you know everything you used to enjoy was actually bad.
Yeah, right.
Brian Intihar of Spider-Man 2, in fact, gives us some insight into how these and many other decisions are approached.
Give people the stuff you know they want, so you can inject things that maybe they aren't familiar with or maybe they don't know they want, but make them like that stuff.
They come in a series you're already invested in, with the distinct goal of injecting these values and beliefs because they know they already have you on the line. Their ideal is quite literally changing everything you enjoy to reflect their own worldview, where you're force-fed it, until you like it, or more accurately, accept it. But if that doesn't sound politically motivated to you, somehow, then let's listen to the CEO of Sweet Baby this time.
If you're a creative working in AAA, which I did for many, many years, put this stuff up to your higher-ups, and if they don't see the value in what you're asking for when you ask for consultants, when you ask for research, go have a coffee with your marketing team and just terrify them with the possibility of what's going to happen if they don't give you what you want.
Kim Belair, like Anita before her, sees no issue admitting that they try to push these values on developers, if they ever receive backlash. Which isn't to say they always do, I'm positive there are plenty of people in this industry with similar ideological goals, and Kim implies this herself. But she also brazenly brought up these cases where they butt heads with developers, which leads us to an interesting question, doesn't it? Why would they view themselves as having so much power in this situation, especially when dealing with their bosses? Well, a simple answer could very well be what Kim said, the threat of being seen as a bigot as a form of blackmail. But it runs deeper, as Sweet Baby, despite getting the brunt of the media attention, is not the source of the problems in the industry. They are a mere symptom. One of many, in fact, as several other similarly designed companies exist. Black Girl Gamers, Hit Detection, Balance Patch, Silver String Media, GamerX, Dragon Baby, Weird Ghost, Bare Knuckle, then Henshin if we're talking anime, as well as several others I am less familiar with. Some of these companies even having direct ties to the original Gamergate with whom is running them. But as for their similar operations, we're not simply referring to the fact that they're consulting companies. As when Sweet Baby and similar are attacked, the idea is put forth that gamers are conspiracy theorists, that they're freaking out over the norm of the existence of consulting companies. But this is of course gaslighting. There is obviously a need and desire for that type of work historically, and if you want a positive example, then look no further than Ghost of Tsushima. This is a game made by American-based company Sucker Punch, taking place on the Japanese island. When developing the game, they spoke to both historians surrounding the period they were covering, as well as a consultant to help them understand the art of samurai sword fighting styles for motion capture, with the goal of creating an authentic experience. This makes perfect sense. They simply sought out those who could elevate the experience by helping them reach greater historical accuracy. It was so successful that the developers were honored as tourism ambassadors. But that's not the kind of service these Sweet Baby tier consulting companies are serving. We've already seen them admit their goal is to come in and change things people already enjoy as a Trojan horse, to insert their agenda pushing. But to make a more direct comparison to the story of Tsushima, I'd like to once again look back at Spider-Man 2. In the game, Miles Morales has a Puerto Rican flag in his home, as he's half Puerto Rican. Except, wait a minute. That's the Cuban flag, that the devs then had to patch out later to make it the proper flag. This is their whole MO, that they're the experts in diversity and representation, yet they couldn't even bother Googling what the correct flag for a country is. Comparing these people to actual consulting companies is insulting, but it goes further. The Spanish subtitles for the game were near incomprehensible to native speakers, because when localized, they were instructed to use the American liberal Latinx presentation of the language. So any words that are gendered had their spellings altered to be more inclusive, turning it into something no one actually speaks or knows. They butchered an entire language because everything is strictly done through this progressive lens, whether it's actually beneficial to the product or the people they champion. These consulting companies don't exist because of some practical value. They exist because of political motivations and a system of incentives set by ESG. Most of you watching this are probably already at least vaguely familiar with ESG, or environmental social governance, how immensely powerful investment firms such as BlackRock are using their capital to compel companies into complying ideologically. Nowadays, you'd be hard-pressed to find a major developer or publisher that does not have a section on their website assuring their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, for this exact reason. In contrast, many enlightened centrists and disingenuous leftists like to espouse lines like, all of this is happening for purely capitalistic reasons. There's no political motivation behind such ESG incentives. Companies are only being pressured into such behavior because it's simply good business. These would all be great points to make if it was anywhere close to reality. Vanguard, an investment firm of comparable scale to BlackRock, managing over $8 trillion in assets behind their ESG initiative, stated in a 2023 financial report that they withdrew from ESG because it provided no advantage or profit over more broad-based investing. The article later followed this up by saying, ESG investment vehicles have higher expense ratios than their non-ESG alternatives. But this isn't just the case at the level of transnational financial management, as when we look at these game companies that involve themselves with ESG, or the now more used term DEI, this expense becomes obvious. Recently, the Pokemon company International, so their Western branch, had a listing for a position within DEI, which would pay north of $200K a year, and considering they would most likely not be hiring just one person in this department, that number balloons fast. even if it was just 3 or 4 people, you'd be looking at around $900K a year. And what is that money giving you, the consumer, you ask? Well, we can already see it in all branches of the Pokemon company. The mainline series had its iconic art style desecrated in Gen 9, replacing it with something more akin to a knockoff mobile game, whereas the concept of gender is simply an amorphous blob. Meanwhile, the international branch, even before this position, was already pumping out B-Mouse shows focused on diversity and saying, hey, remember childhood? The bullet point list of every American piece of media now. Then further, there's the Go branch, which as stated in the past, I believe to be the start of this American-centric shift, but even this division got its own set of updates for the modern age recently, changing the character models to be more reflective of the real world, as they say, which fans are not happy with, but it does perhaps demonstrate how things are never enough. The goalpost for DEI in these areas just keeps moving. So people who spent real-world money to make a character they identify with, well, sorry, everything has to be an ugly, genderless blob to be inclusive now. And pay special attention to the gender these complaints belong to, because despite the narrative being sold, anytime a product actually has a player base of women, they are some of the biggest complainers when designs are affected, particularly in character creation. Suffice to say, it's a money sink, with no value to the common folk buyer. It's no surprise that companies like Sega, Blizzard, or Sony, who heavily market themselves with their focus on ESG in recent years, are announcing bigger and bigger layoffs. Microsoft being the latest example, as right next to their current guidelines for games telling developers they can't so much as add a single curve to a woman, you can find articles announcing a cut of another 2,000 employees. So while there are certainly more factors at play to this loss of jobs and money, it is not demonstrable that ESG has helped any of these businesses, and if anything, it's resulted in less profits. The only reason for such things to exist then is strictly political motivation. To that end though, I get the people who want to try and ignore politics and point fingers at the other side to say, they're the real racists, they're everything they accuse us of. Because while ESG is asking companies to pay again upwards of $900K a year to add more brown people to games, we've already had that for free and better. Forspoken, consulted by Black Girl Gamers, is a game synonymous with this topic, being such a colossal failure that it killed the subsidiary studio that created it, where the main character has thus become a laughingstock for their Marvel movie tier quips and other annoying traits. But BGG and other defenders will often posit that this mockery, as well as other forms of dislike toward Forspoken, simply stem from the fact that the protagonist is a black female. Yet Sony had a dark-skinned female protagonist that was beloved by many, which was Gravity Rush's cat. In fact, it's quite ironic, because Sony did everything in their power to play down her series, zero marketing, removing her from their oh-so-empowering Women's Day banner, and so much more. It's like they wanted to forget her, even if fans didn't. She found success despite the more aggressive attempts to erase her as the Jim Ryan Sony era continued. But of course, these race baiters would never even entertain a conversation about this, because it's not about there being a brown person or a woman. It's about there being a liberal-approved caricature of one. Do you think San Andreas could exist in this ESG era, a game in which some of the most iconic black characters in Western gaming come from? Absolutely not. Despite someone on Twitter definitely writing the laughingstock of a tweet saying, if it was released today, it would be called woke. It couldn't, and this is proven time and time again. Rockstar literally had press releases saying they are going to move away from any depiction of a minority that can be seen as problematic or harmful. So we're in this Urkelification era of gaming, where these characters must all conform to the same rigid progressive interpretation of what someone with a dark skin tone has to look and act like. So, to repeat, I get the how and why for falling back on this defensive tactic. I genuinely do. But it's pointless for the very reason I just discussed. The same way they discredit characters that don't fall into this narrow view, they do the same to real people. Pointing out that these movements are comprised of multiple shades of individuals, or saying you're black yourself. Well, that's just gonna get you called in Uncle Tom. You can't win in the proving the other side is actually racist competition, because they just redefine what counts as racism. Look no further than the fact that the majority of these diversity consulting companies have employees openly making derogatory remarks toward white people on their social media, whether it's in relation to their very existence in the world or the video game industry. In fact, because this is the only form of hatred liberals are allowed to express, instead of putting it under some guise, we've even seen the definition of white people extend to certain demographics of Asians at times, with Katie Robinson of Compulsion Games doing just that. But there is no greater example of how vile their minds work than something I'd be remiss if I did not bring up in this video. The fact that Chris Kindred of Sweet Baby, at the passing of Akira Toriyama's death, perhaps the most influential creator of our time, a man who has touched just about every part of this world with his influence on the creative fields he was a part of, took a moment to attack his legacy's lack of black representation. The body wasn't even cold. These are some of the most vile people to ever exist, and are the very definition of a wolf in sheep's clothing. To that end, they portray themselves as an ideology of wholesome equal opportunists, yet they're only motivated by hatred. Why do you think none of these journalists and companies had an issue when trans activists made a list to harass and blacklist any individual who played Hogwarts Legacy? Or perhaps an even more direct comparison, why have they never cared about the multitude of de nouveau lists made to avoid any game with such a feature, in the same manner as the Sweet Baby list? The answer is because they don't have a problem with any form of protest, if it benefits them. The condemning and reframing is simply a tactic to silence anybody who stands against them. They're going to name call you no matter what, and the future depends on your ability to hold your ground and not play their game. You aren't winning a factual argument against a group whose sole tactic is emotional manipulation. Focus on what actually matters instead of trying to prove yourself to the people who will never accept anything less than total compliance. To set us on a positive note, now that I feel my point is made clear, it's not only those companies bleeding money, but the journalist institutes that push these things. Gamergate 1, in comparison, was going against a strong, well-oiled propaganda machine. From day one, they were all pumping out articles, spinning a narrative in unison. But now, well, half of these companies are gone. Every few weeks, a new article does limp out onto the internet, but to little recognition, and it's always accompanied by a community note on the biggest social media platform in existence, where its lies are dispelled before most can even read it. Kotaku, probably the biggest name in the business of corrupt gaming journalism, had massive layoffs in March. The remaining staff were told they will need to pump out 50 guides a month to keep their position. So even the owners of the company are now telling them to play games for once instead of writing hate bait. That doesn't mean the site will completely lose what it's become known for, as there's stragglers like Alyssa Mercanti, vowing to still make dishonest and defamatory hit pieces. But even in her case, she's threatening to go back to being an internet prostitute if things don't work out. Which, yes, you heard me right. The journalistic qualifications at Kotaku are literally the ability to spread your butthole. Very telling. However, even without them, it's not like these tactics won't be picked up by other sites, as the exact same week IGN wrote a slanderous article on Stellar Blade, calling it sexist and accusing the creator of having never seen a woman, despite his wife being one of the sexist character designers at the company. A situation not at all shocking to many of you, I imagine, and has probably only escalated since this video was finished. As with Jim Ryan stepping down at Sony, many see this game's success as a threat to the current rhetoric. Not only does it star a stereotypical attractive woman that didn't get beat with the ugly stick by the development team after they mocapped the actress's face, but there's also the possibility that someone at Sony sees the writing on the wall and doesn't want to keep towing the line of blocking and censoring these games, like so many before. However, that before is also the reason I still don't trust the company. My point here is, though, despite these things' continued existence, the world is in a much different place than it was the first time this was really gaining momentum. And if people approach it properly, I really do think things will continue to change in a positive direction, or at least it gives it the best chance to. So in saying that, it should also be noted that I harped on some creators at the beginning of this video, but I don't have ill will toward them, at least in relation to this topic, even concerning the act Ma'am and similar talking heads. While there are exceptions like Boogie, who is a detriment to literally every movement he grifts from, on the whole, I think the fact that these types are switching positions is a positive, as it shows that even those who only spit out the most agreeable position at the time, when they're asked, see the promise here. To that end, they function as a great indicator of where the tide is turning. It's just important to not let these types of faces be a symbol or something to rally behind, like the original Gamergate did, because as I've expressed numerous times, it's like protecting yourself with a piece of cardboard in a lava storm. As for those others, whether ignorance or willful ignorance, I do think their hearts are in the right place, but it's important to get the facts right and know both who and the scope of what you're fighting, where attempting to obfuscate the real issues only leads us back to the same path as Gamergate 1, and those who do not learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. So with that in mind, I hope a lot of people continue to take a more active role, and be aggressive this time, instead of cowering. Don't be afraid to say what the problems are, and don't back down just because you got called a mean name. Speaking specifically of that Steam group, I hope it expands to covering games from all these companies and the bigger issues at large. Despite my criticism of those who run it, it's largely been a beneficial thing, and I commend that. I just want to see things improve, and I hope you've gotten that takeaway from this video. As for me personally, I do a lot of coverage on problems in localization, which have a good amount of crossover with this topic, and in them I frequently find myself ending said coverage with an almost call to action, similar to this script, to the point where I'm becoming increasingly more self-aware. But there's a reason for me doing this. I used to operate very similar to the defensive types I criticize. Old videos even exist as remnants of that, and it only ever led to being taken advantage of, or the things I care about being continually harmed. Where in the past couple of years, I've taken more aggressive approaches in contacting companies, specifically authors, as well as bringing more eyes on things with my content, not sugarcoating the issues, and certainly not backing down because of accusations made up about either me or my beliefs. As a result, I've seen success because of that, and have witnessed even more successes brought on by others. Things are better for a lot of what I care about, and even the times when they aren't, well, I still feel better because of that effort. To that end, I have one final thing to say to you. A lot of people talking about these topics will tell you that it's as simple as voting with your wallet. And while that is certainly part of it, if it was that simple, well, these issues wouldn't have come into existence initially. These hobbies weren't exactly unprofitable. Voices and actions were a very real part in creating the problems of the industry, and they're just as important to solving them. So while I can't exactly tell you what comes next, I know if there's any hope for the sequel to be better than the original, it starts here. Well, thanks for watching, especially to those appearing on screen, whether they be patrons or YouTube members, as their support affords me the time to work on these things. And if you want to help the channel out in the same manner, or by simply leaving a like on the video and subscribing, it all goes a long way, so another thank you to those who choose to do that. Till next time.